welcome to episode number 24 of the Path to Follow podcast. Today we have Mr. Matt Baum, class of 93 from Gilman, on the set. Matt, it's good to see you. It's great to have you in.
Thanks for having me. I'm flattered to be here.
Yeah, it's awesome. How is everything going for you this year? It's been total 180 in terms of teaching and for everybody, just brand new skills and ways of going about the classroom. How have you been doing with everything?
Everything's been, I'd say, fine this year. It's certainly not as fun as a normal year. I think all of us as teachers have thought about what we miss about sort of normal school. And I think I'm not alone in saying the thing I miss most is the interaction with students. It's so different with half the kids, or probably more than half the kids on Zoom at a time, not hanging out with my advisees, not hanging out with my students in the same way. The Zoom stuff can get pretty tiring, as I'm sure you know, but it's been fine. And I think I've, as far as my classes are concerned, just tried to keep it simple in my own head of saying, are they learning? Are they thinking? And if they are, then, sort of doing my job. I hope I'm not setting the expectations too low, but that's sort of how I'm thinking about it.
So in my first year at Gilman, I tried to observe as many different teachers as I could to gather some skill sets and see what other teachers were doing, since I didn't really know what it looked like and felt to be in front of the classroom. And I remember sitting in on a couple of your U.S. since 1960.
Yep. At that time, since 45. I changed. 45. Yeah. So I changed the class. But yep.
U.S. history since 1945, and you had a super strong class that first year. I think Noah, Seth.
Yes.
And just everyone in that class was very strong.
Yes.
But I remember the way it was structured. It was almost, you would use maybe like a Netflix clip or something on, a video, and then it was almost like a debate style type of class. Are you finding that you can still have that same atmosphere over Zoom with the discussion?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's harder, right? And I haven't done quite as much of that. I mean, first of all, it's actually made me think a lot about the media that I show. It's just harder to do that over Zoom. Had kids sort of consume more of that on their own. I think my seniors are super strong this year. I mean, I always get such a nice crop of seniors. So they're, I'd say, more equipped to do that sort of discussion and some of the sort of debate stuff. It's a little bit harder with the younger kids, I find, who just aren't as eager or willing to sort of jump in and press unmute. My seniors, I think, are more willing to do that. So I've tried to, but it's I think not quite like it would be in a normal year. What
are some different ways you're finding work to go about teaching in this situation, or what has been working really well for you?
I trying to vary it and not have, and I'll step back for a second. I think one thing when people talk about what works in our current situation are things that we probably always did do or maybe should have done, and now it's just sort of exaggerated. So, we were teaching 80-minute classes last year. You should vary instruction anyway, right? I think it's even more important to do that on Zoom, though, right? Where I'm not just talking for 60 of the 70 minutes, doing breakout rooms, doing group work, having some asynchronous, some Loom videos that I'll record and have them watch, some discussion board. So, I think just trying to vary it as much as possible. And again, another thing that's probably good practice anyway, but I've really thought more about this year is having students produce something at the end of class. I guess teachers sometimes call those exit tickets. Mm-hmm. It's so easy to be passive on Zoom. And so I think especially for the half the kids that aren't in the classroom with me, to make sure that by the end of class, they've taken a quiz or posted a discussion board or done a Flipgrid video where I know they've gotten something out of class. And again, that's probably something I should do most classes, even if it's sort of normal settings anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a great strategy. And when I was in my first year of teaching, observing Bryan, one of the things he did was make sure everyone was taking notes, and it was very that was so emphasized in his classes. Everyone has their notebook out, writing. It doesn't matter, how much you're writing, but at least it shows me as a teacher that you are there and you're putting stuff down. Yep. And you can't do that over Zoom. So I think, that's, I should do that a little bit more in my classes, the exit ticket, or just reflecting on what we just talked about for 60 minutes or 80 minutes or however long the class is.
Yep. Yeah, that's a great point. I was a big note guy. I would actually collect notes. Usually when students would take a test with my 10th graders. At the end of every unit, I'd collect the notes. So yeah, they had to have paper notes out. Obviously, I can't do that in the current format. So I missed that. It was a long time. English teacher Dan Christian. Did you ever cross paths with Mr. Christian?
He was here my first year, but I didn't get to know him that well.
Of course, yeah. But he was just teaching. I think probably just one class at that. Trying to put the years. Anyway, he used to say to class, "You know what this looks like? This looks like school." And have kids take off their coats and put out their notebooks. So I used to say, that's just so much of what I do. I'm just stealing from other teachers, especially him. But yeah, I say this is what school looks like. Like you have your notebook out, pen and paper. And so yeah, I missed that. I missed that part of it this year.
Yeah, and I've never been one to emphasize like you need to write everything out of my mouth down, or you need to annotate everything in the text, because I think there's value in not writing and just listening for the whole time. Yep. But as a teacher who's trying to help students get to the next level and actually get to that listening part, like you have to at least show me. I need some evidence or some proof that you're there with me.
Exactly.
Which has been definitely tough over Zoom, but there are other ways of doing that, as you said.
Yep.
So what do you teach here at Gilman?
Right now I'm teaching 3 sections of the 10th grade Making of Modern Europe class. I think this is my 5th year teaching that class, I think. And then a senior elective, which is now U.S. since 1960. For a long time, it's been U.S. since 1945. And I'm not sure when that course debuted. I actually took it when I was a senior. And then Jerry Thornberry taught it for a long time. And now it's U.S. This is the first year it's U.S. since 1960.
Why the change? Why did we change?
I felt like I was just sort of giving lip service to 45 to 60. The kids were least interested in that. They were more likely to have covered that in their U.S. history classes. I was just sort of like, let's get through the 50s. I thought the kids felt like, and I felt like it got a little more interesting once we got to the Kennedys. And I also was frustrated. It's like sort of scrambling to get to the 2000s, and that should be the fun part of the class, I think, for the kids. Who were alive for some of what we're talking about. Certainly their parents were alive for the 2000s. I think they're more interested in that. So this year, actually, I started the class at 2000. We got up to 2016 so that we could be sort of current when the election was taking place in November. And now we've moved back. So now I'm back in like 1968.
Oh, wow. Now. So you reversed the structure.
I sort of reversed the structure a little bit. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
What do you typically start with? I guess in 45 when you taught that, what did you start with?
Started with the start of the Cold War. Like a brief introduction, reminders of what World War II was about, and then the causes of the Cold War. And this year, again, reversing it, we started with the 2000 election, the very controversial Bush-Gore election, and then had them do some research on 9/11.
Are they, for the most part, are they doing like kind of independent research on that, or is that more discussion, or how is that?
On 9/11 itself? Yeah. They choose one question that night. I sort of intentionally phrase it that way, in that 9/11 is still recent. I mean, even though my students now weren't alive for it.
This might be the first year, maybe?
I think that's right. The seniors weren't. I mean, in the last, 5 years, they basically had no memory of it, right? I don't even want to know how old you were on 2001.
I do have faint memories of like
faint.
It was just very.
So I'm trying to do the math. You were toddler? How old were you?
First grade, maybe?
Yeah, okay.
Or preschool?
Yeah, so very faint memories. But anyway, I say we still don't really know the answers. It's still, even if there were 2 decades removed to what 9/11 meant, but we know a lot of questions it raised. So investigate one question that 9/11 raised, and then try to come to some sort of answer. And so that's how I approach it. And then, so they're doing some research on a question like, I'm trying to think of some of the topics. Why did it take so long to find bin Laden? Or how did this affect our Middle East policy in Iraq or Afghanistan? Or how did it affect how we interrogate prisoners or something like that. Investigate that question, and then did some research on that, and then they presented it to the class and wrote a short paper too.
How are those presentations? I haven't done too much. I've done a little bit of that, but how are those going through the virtual? Because this class is totally virtual, right? Or is that hybrid?
It's hybrid. Yeah, it's hybrid.
Okay.
This year I don't have any girls enrolled. I'm not exactly sure why that is. If part of that is due to COVID. Mm-hmm. I've always taught usually 5, 6, 7 Bryn Mawr students along, but not this year. But anyway, it's hybrid. And I mean, again, I have such a strong group of seniors. I think that class typically, it's a full year history elective. It's an honors elective. So it typically attracts kids that are really interested in strong history students. So anyway, so the presentations were great. They were really attentive to each other. The kids in class were on the Zoom and shared their screen. The kids on Zoom shared their screen, and so I thought they did a great job with them.
One question that I've thought a little bit about is when I was observing classes in my first and really my second year too, I was doing as part of the master's program here at Gilman like a year-long research question.
Yep.
And my question was all about, since I was teaching junior English with boys and girls in the same room,
yep.
I had so much trouble in that first and second year with just making it a lively and discussion-oriented atmosphere as an English class should be with girls and guys in the same room for the first time. It was awkward. My first year for sure. It was super awkward. It was hard to get people to speak up. Part of that was because of my inexperience as a teacher. But when I observed your classes, it was so visibly comfortable.
Yeah.
And I actually had some conversations with some of your students that year about what are some things that Mr. Baum does in his classroom to make this so comfortable. And I've noticed a few things, but what do you think as a teacher of typically a coordinate class like that? What do you think it is that you do to provide that type of atmosphere?
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I'm flattered that you said that. Coordination's hard. And we've talked a lot about that this year as a department because we're not coordinating the 11th grade class and how different that's been. I'm a big fan of coordination overall. But I do think some teachers, I think our department's very supportive of coordination, but have breathed a little bit of a sigh of relief of sort of not having to deal with the issues that you talked about. I think, first of all, the class that you observed was a senior class. That's different because they've had coordination the year before. So many of the Bryn Mawr students have been all should have been on the Gilman campus, either for English or history. So I think it's sort of an apples to oranges comparison. And seniors are just a year older and a little bit more mature. I've taught the junior class, and some of my best experiences as a teacher, I feel like where the class has gelled the most have been in those junior coordinated classes, and some of my worst where I feel like the class just can't get people to talk, or the boys are only talking, the girls aren't talking, or in those junior coordinated classes. So it's tough. But to try to get to the question, I find myself more at the beginning of the year being very intentional about it. Welcoming the girls, even explicitly saying, I hope you don't think of this as a road game. This is every bit of much of your classroom as it is in any of the boys' classrooms. And then doing my best to sort of know what they're up to outside of class. I think that's a hard part of coordination too. The boys who are in the play, or you saw them on the basketball court or whatever. I would try to make sure I at least knew what the girls were up to, and if I could support them in some way and go to their games or their plays or whatever, and just sort of something to break through and talk about, right? Even those 5 minutes before class, that sort of banter, you sort of prime them that this is a space where they can feel comfortable and where they can talk. And also, it sounds like almost lower school stuff, but even requires seating, where, I told them it's not going to be like a middle school mixer where the boys are on one side and the girls are on another side.
Yeah, I tried so much of those experimenting like that in my second year, because the first year I had a great class. I had awesome students, so I feel like I'll at least keep in touch with in
Yep.
the future.
Yep.
But it was very stale in there. And that was one thing that I really wanted to work on going forward, was like, how do I make this more comfortable? It's English class. You're supposed to feel confident in what you say, or at least know that there's no right or wrong answer.
Did you feel like the girls were more hesitant to speak up, or did you just have a quiet group of boys?
I felt like it was only a few students who wanted to speak up, and I think both boys and girls were very strong in that class, and they had a lot to say, and I would grade their papers and be like, wow, you're really thinking deeply about this. Right. Why didn't you say anything in class?
Yes, exactly.
It's because I could have done, I think it was my first year, so it was like I was kind of nervous up there too, you know?
Maybe, yeah.
Or it was the group. It was maybe a mix of both, you know?
And that's another sort of part of, again, going back to using strategies that we probably should use anyway, but we're using now more, that we're doing some distance learning, is there are other ways other than using your voice to contribute, right? Like discussion boards or Flipgrids or whatever, putting in the chat, right? Mm-hmm. I've actually tried to use the chat function a fair amount on Zoom. And so one is that gets the students' quote unquote voice out there, but also once they've put it out there, you can then call on them. You know that they have something good to say, right?
Mm-hmm. And on the virtual end of things this year, I've just started kind of cold calling on some guys because the first couple months, and even I still do this, I go on there like, how's everyone doing? It's like no one's going to respond to that.
Exactly.
You know?
Exactly.
You have to say, hey, Chris, what's going on?
Yes.
What'd you watch last night on Netflix?
Yes.
How are things?
Right.
So there are different skills and ways to go about the virtual situation too. So it's tough, but it's fun experimenting with that.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the icebreakers, and I even something like What'd You Watch, or what are you watching these days? Again, it just sort of gets people like you can press unmute and you can contribute, right?
Mm-hmm. So Matt, I'm interested in your time as a student at Gilman, and maybe what about Gilman did you love so much, or some memories that you had that were so fun that made you want to come back here?
Yeah, so I was here for 12 years. I was a 12-year man, as they say, which was the most that they didn't have a kindergarten or pre-K. So I guess my first year was 1981, I think, the fall of 81, which is, I graduated in 93. I mean, I'll say that most of my memories are upper school, just because that was, the time when you're making your most formative memories, I guess. In terms of why I wanted to come back, I mean, I'll credit or blame so many of the great teachers that I had, and who I really, I don't know if idolized is the right word, but respected maybe is the better word. But teachers and coaches like Tim Holly, Dan Christian, Jerry Thornberry. I don't know if you've ever come across Doc Thornberry, but long time.
Seen him in the library a few times.
Okay, gotcha.
Yep.
History
Had some conversations with him.
Gotcha. And people that first of all seemed to really like what they were doing. The idea that you could sort of spend your career engaged in these ideas and reading these cool books. And talking about them with students, and coaching, they just made it seem like it was, first of all, fun, and also just intellectually stimulating. So I'd say that's more than anything probably why I pursued teaching, and I was teaching elsewhere, before I came to Gilman, and then wanted to move back to Baltimore, and luckily there was a position here.
Was your interest in history something that was intrinsic from a certain point, or were there influences who led you down that?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, certainly Jerry Thornberry, I would give him the most credit. I mean, his classes just, I think, awakened that. My dad was not a historian or history teacher. He worked in finance, but he was interested in history too. So we'd had a lot of sort of dinner table conversations, and that was a topic that he was always interested in. And then Doc Thornberry's classes, and I took one of his electives when I was a junior, and then another when I was a senior. I think probably awakened that in me, and then majored in history in college.
What was Thornberry like as a teacher?
Oh man! So if you've had some conversations with him, one of the things, because I know as a colleague of his, he's exactly the same in the classroom and out, which is to say, he's incredibly passionate. He's funny. He he was the most challenging teacher I ever had. I gave a tribute to him at an assembly before he retired, and I told everybody he, as I said, dropped the double nickels on me my first paper assignment. He gave me a 55 on my first
Really?
my first assignment. I got a lot better from there. Just to be good. But I didn't know how to sort of do history like that, reading these big books and sort of dealing with these big ideas. But he was challenging. I mean, and then I took over his American government class, and I was asking my students to do like half of what he would ask them. I mean, he just had a way of demanding, and students loved him, but of demanding them reading and writing a ton, and was just so engaging in class too.
Isn't it funny? I feel like my family has talked about this with just my sisters and I, in terms of our teachers growing up were often the most strict teachers were the best teachers.
Yes.
Or the most, like, you probably did a pretty good job on that paper, but he gave you a 55.
I'm not sure about that, but yeah.
He saw something
yes.
in you that,
Yes.
I mean, now you're a history teacher
Right.
here. So,
Right. Yeah, no doubt. And I think about that. And I mean, you can only be who you are, right? I mean, and it's probably not a good idea to just sort of only imitate the people that you venerate. But yeah, no question. I think the teachers that you probably liked the most or respected the most are the ones that demanded the most out of you. Same with coaches, right?
Yeah. And you played a number of sports here at Gilman too. Basketball is your main sport?
Basketball and baseball. I was on the team. I'm not sure that's the same as playing, especially once I got to varsity. You can ask Coach Holly and Coach Jordan about that. But yeah, I played basketball and baseball and love sports. That was a big part. Certainly when I think back to my fondest memories at Gilman, a lot of them are fresh off JV and varsity basketball, no doubt.
Awesome. And then, so before you came back to teach at Gilman, you were up in Providence teaching. After you graduated from Brown with history degree, right? Did you immediately want to get into teaching, or was there a decision at that point in your life, or did you do something else for a little bit, or how did that play out?
Yeah, I'll take you through my resume try to do it briefly, but yeah, I did. I mean, I actually went into college thinking I wanted to be a teacher, and again,
really?
Credit my teachers at Gilman. And so I majored in history, but took some education classes, and then I taught for 2 years at a great private school in Montgomery, Alabama, and then moved away from it for a few years. I worked on a political campaign for a year. I worked in finance in Boston for 3 years, and was thinking pretty hard about staying in that area or law school or business school. Literally had taken an LSAT class, and then decided to go back and get a master's in history and say I was going to go back to teaching. So then went back to teaching in Providence, back to Providence. Got my master's at Brown and then stayed in Providence for another 8 years before I came back to Baltimore.
And the school you taught at in Providence, I was looking at some pictures of it. Looks like an amazing school.
Yeah.
Wheeler School?
Wheeler School, yeah. Good research. I'm impressed.
Yeah, well, I need to know
you come
who I'm talking to.
Yep, the Wheeler School, which is a great school, sort of almost in the middle of the Brown campus, co-ed, nursery through 12, private school.
What did you teach there?
What did I teach there?
Yeah.
Upper school history as well, mostly, U.S. history, and then a contemporary world issues senior elective class.
So you've taught a number of courses in the history department. Is there one that's your favorite? Is the U.S. history since 45 your favorite course, or?
Probably the course that gets me most excited. One way maybe to think about it is when I'm reading on my own, that's the topic I would want to read about most and sort of think about that class the most outside of class. I've always been U.S. history focused, and then I sort of forced myself to teach the Euro class 5 years ago. I learned a ton in those 5 years. But yeah, I'd say, and even as a student, the sort of U.S., since World War II has probably been my favorite topic.
The Euro Civ, or the making of modern Europe, is one that I don't know too much about. I haven't observed that class. Yeah. What do you guys go through in that course?
It's a pretty standard traditional European history. I mean, now start at the Renaissance and sort of get as far as you can get, which is usually through the fall of the Berlin Wall or the end of the Cold War, is where I end the class in the early 90s. So right now, kids are just taking their midterms, talking about, and then we'll come to class tomorrow actually talking about Darwinism and Marxism. And the thing I like about that class that maybe surprised me a little bit the first time I taught it is it's not so heavy on like who was the king of this year or whatever. It's more of a history of ideas class, and so it gets into a lot of philosophy. And so we can have some pretty good discussions in that class.
Less regurgitation, more discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's the best.
Exactly.
Well, that those are the types of classes, at least I try to structure my English class like that, because I feel like I'm learning just as much alongside of everyone than just, memorize these chapters.
Exactly. And there's some of that, like you have to know some facts, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, more about the history of ideas.
Cool.
Yeah.
So in your now U.S. history since 1960 course, is there a decade or is there a unit that you get really excited about every year to teach?
Yeah,
and is there one that you kind of dread teaching that you want to change around to?
I don't know if I'd say there's one I dread teaching. I mean, I've always been really interested in the 60s and Vietnam and civil rights especially. So and that's maybe why I changed the class to since 60, because I would sort of get bogged down there and then sort of have to scramble to cover the rest. So to me, that's still really exciting. I wonder if part of that is because that when I was studying it, in the late 80s, early 90s when I was at Gilman, it felt like, recent history that my parents lived through and remembered. So I'd say still for me, that's probably the most fun. I think, again, the students probably perk up most once we get to the 90s and beyond, and especially in the 2000s. And it is fun and different to teach history that I not only lived through, but lived through as an adult and really remember, like the Bush years, for example. And so we, again, I started the class in 2000, so spent a fair amount on the Bush era, and just remember living through that and what I was thinking at the time. So I'd say that's been an enjoyable part for me to teach too.
I think the 60s, for me at least, I would be interested in learning. So the way I kind of rationalize that is like when I'm on Netflix and I'm just searching around, and I hate this about Netflix and HBO is the browsing.
Yes.
Because I feel like I spend more time browsing than actually watching anything.
The paralysis of like, what should I actually click on? Yes. Too much.
Because there's so much out there.
Yep.
But recently I was like, all right, I need to choose something. But I was watching some of the RFK and learning a little bit about him. And he's an interesting figure of the 60s. And I've always been interested in JFK's presidency.
Yep. So was that, what's that documentary? It's like Bobby Kennedy for president or something?
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
I haven't watched it. It's in my queue or on my list or whatever they say. Yeah. So that's interesting that you would be drawn to that. Yeah, he's certainly a fascinating figure.
Because I feel like I don't know, in school I didn't learn much about him because he was just kicking off his political career almost.
Before
he was almost in the shadows, but not really with Kennedy. He was right on his side making those decisions as Attorney General, right?
You got it.
He was always there.
Exactly. I feel like most, I could be wrong about that, but ask our students, but I feel like most students actually don't even really realize that John Kennedy had a brother who was also killed. That John Kennedy's killed in 1963 and then his brother killed in 1968. I think that's sort of news to most of
so much. I mean, so much misfortune to the Kennedy family.
God. Just when we talk a little bit about that, just awful and tragic. Yeah, I mean, including just this past. I had this weird. Just at the beginning of quarantine, I was watching the movie Chappaquiddick, which is about Ted Kennedy, who's another brother, longtime senator, and then watched I thought really good Netflix had it, a movie called Chappaquiddick, which is about this tragic car accident that he was involved in. And just as I was watching that movie, there was an incident. I'm trying to remember who it was. It was Bobby Kennedy's granddaughter and great-grandson in Maryland had an accident where they were sort of trying to fetch a ball, and they both died in just this past March or April. Yeah. I mean, so anyway, just a ton of tragedy in their family life.
Do you does your class debate or talk about the assassination of JFK and what happened there?
Again, that's a rabbit hole we can go down so far and spend so much time there. There's a really good documentary as part of the 60s documentary that I think you might have observed me showing some of that same series
That's on Netflix, right? I was trying to find
I think it's on Netflix now. Yeah. I think CNN originally did it, and now it's on Netflix.
Because they have 60s and they have 70s, 80s,
90s, 2000s.
Yeah, they have everything.
Yeah. I mean, we could like spend my whole class just watching those, you know?
Yeah.
And so we watch a lot of that. It's like a 90-minute documentary. We probably watch half of it. So we go through that a little bit. And the thesis of that documentary, which I think I am sympathetic to, says that the reason there's so many conspiracy theories is because we don't want to believe that some random dude could affect history that much. You know, it just doesn't seem, it's asymmetrical. It doesn't make sense that just one Lee Harvey Oswald could affect history. So we have to create all these conspiracy theories to make it sort of almost more settling to us that it has to be a larger conspiracy. So I'm not a big conspiracy guy myself. And I think the documentary sort of takes that stance too.
Do you have a set opinion or thought on that assassination, or are you kind of just interested in both sides?
Yeah, I mean, I think he was the lone.
Maybe not both sides, but all of the different sides to that conversation.
I think he was the lone assassin, and again, I think it's we just don't like to think of history that can hinge on one guy. So that's where I sort of come out on that. But I do think it's really interesting to think about why there's so many conspiracy theories.
Yeah. One of the reasons that not one of the reasons, but one of the motivations for starting the podcast is I've always loved watching Joe Rogan, and I love podcasts in the first place, but Rogan has a few episodes where he goes deep into the assassination of JFK, and he is totally, that's one thing he takes a hard stance on, is like Lee Harvey Oswald did not act alone.
Oh, really?
Like,
Interesting.
I'm a gun guy, and there's no way that bullet could have,
Interesting.
So I just find the conversation interesting, and the facts and the discussion about it, and how you can have such a hard conviction on many sides about one single thing that happened.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's interesting. I've actually been to what's called the 6th Floor Museum in Dallas, which is where Oswald was when he fired the shot, the 6th floor of the book depository building. And you can stand almost right next to, there's like, you can see where he stood, and then there's an X on the street of where the motorcade was when Kennedy was hit, and it's not an easy shot.
Right. It's a ridiculous shot.
Yeah, it's a ridiculous shot, and he fired a few times. That was a fascinating museum. That's interesting. You've mentioned the Joe Rogan podcast. I know that's supposed to be a really good one. I've actually never listened to it. I'm a big podcast guy myself, but I'll try to check those out.
Yeah, I mean, I just like Rogan because he's got such an open mind, and whoever he has on his podcast, he's not going to get in an argument with you on set about something. He's just interested in what you think about it, and he's just a good listener. I think, which is a great quality about him.
Absolutely,
he's done really well with his podcast for sure. So. Question that I've thought a lot about, and actually one of the icebreakers that I do for my classes, hard question, but if you're looking at American history, or even for you as a history teacher, history in general, are there certain individuals or people that if you were a podcast host and you could have on your podcast to talk to, is there anyone that sticks out to you that you'd like to talk to and pick their brain?
That's a great question. I mean, I'm tempted to sort of go right down to the sports, But who would I have on? I mean, I don't want to say the obvious, like I want to talk to Abraham Lincoln, but it would be pretty fascinating to talk to a founding father. I mean, again, maybe the obvious choice, but how about Hamilton, and have him reflect on the musical? You could have him listen to the opening number.
That's a great answer.
Of Hamilton, and just watch his jaw drop to the ground of seeing Lin-Manuel Miranda rap.
I haven't seen it yet.
Rap his life story. You haven't?
It's Disney Plus, right? I need to watch that.
Yep. Obviously, no one's watching it on stage right now. It'll come back to the stage, I'm sure. Yeah, Disney Plus. Do you have Disney Plus?
No, but I would get it to watch.
It's worth a month subscription to watch it.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so maybe I choose him, and start from there. Yeah.
Okay, that's a great answer.
Yeah.
I was actually just watching a little documentary about Hamilton, and then I got HBO. Is the situation right now is just forcing me to start buying these paid subscription channels. It's definitely not good for the bank account, but I got HBO. I'm watching the John Adams.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I know that was a long time
Yeah,
ago.
that was like, I actually remember my daughter was born, so it was probably 2008, 2009 when that came out, because I remember giving her bottles while I was watching that on my TiVo. Yeah.
That was maybe one of the first HBO shows with, what's his name? Dan Giamatti, maybe? Or
Paul Giamatti.
Paul
yeah,
Giamatti.
He played John Adams. Yeah.
He's great.
He's great. I show one episode of that in when I used to teach U.S. history. Yeah.
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 But John Adams would be an interesting
No
figure.
question.
Thomas Jefferson for sure.
No question. Yeah. I mean, Jefferson, to get to all the contradictions, we talk about when I used to teach U.S. history, that the same guy that wrote All Men Are Created Equal also owned slaves, right? Mm-hmm. And owned a lot of slaves. Yeah, that'd be pretty fascinating.
Sarah Lloyd was on the podcast a little while ago, and I was telling her I recently went to Monticello for the first time to see it.
Yeah.
And I think in the experience of seeing his house and where he lived and like the interior of his house and his library, you really get the sense of how much of a great man he was.
Yes.
As contradictory as his life was,
yes.
obviously, but he was just an amazing person.
Yes, and truly brilliant. I mean, absolutely brilliant. Yeah.
Architecture and travels and politics and law and everything.
Yep, no question. So when were you in Monticello?
Right after Thanksgiving, I think I stopped there.
Oh, gotcha. Oh,
Yeah,
so really recent. Okay.
Yeah.
I'd gone as a kid and then took our family 2 summers ago. And yeah, it was fascinating. And get the sense of just how much he loved his home too.
Mm-hmm.
And how much love and care he put into Monticello itself.
Yeah, it's beautiful. And
yep.
I mean, I think his persona comes into full picture when you're actually there looking at it.
Yep. Maybe have him and Hamilton together, since they were such bitter enemies during their lifetimes. Yeah.
How about from your course, 1960s onward?
Yep.
Is there anyone who sticks out you'd like to pick their brain?
I mean, I don't know if it's just because we were talking about him, but Bobby Kennedy would certainly be pretty fascinating. I mean, and again, maybe it's just because we're right there talking about Vietnam, but John Kennedy too. I mean, one of the great what if questions is what he would have done had he lived, as far as Vietnam is concerned, and whether the Vietnam War would have happened. And so to try to actually get his thoughts on that, we were just talking about that last class. And to my mind, and again, I sort of said this before, but my class sort of turns on Vietnam. I mean, so much of what comes next over the next decades is a result of the Vietnam War. And so to get Kennedy's take on that would certainly be pretty fascinating, to say the least.
What are some things that you look at when you study Vietnam? Is there anything that, for people who are interested in digging deeper into that subject, can look at that you might teach in your class?
Yeah, well, there was the recent Ken Burns documentary, which came out 2-3 years ago, maybe, and we watched some of that. And then the way I structure the unit is I assign them each a turning point in the war. So in groups. So I think there are 4 turning points that I have between 1961 and 1968. And then they have to assess what were the options available to either Kennedy or Johnson, and why did Kennedy and Johnson go the route that they went in. So I sort of see the war in these sort of turning points, and almost that the war happened accidentally, and that was just sort of a series of, to use the phrase that politicians always use, of sort of kicking the can down the road. Mm-hmm. And then before you know it, they're 500,000 troops in Vietnam, and 50,000 Americans dead. So that's how I structured that unit.
One of the books that I'm teaching for this short fiction course in the spring is The Things They Carry.
Yeah.
And those short stories and pictures that really create images about that war and the lives lost and the devastation of war.
Yep.
It's an amazing one. Yeah,
Tim O'Brien is a big part of that Ken Burns documentary, actually. He's interviewed a number of times. I'm glad you're teaching that. I don't think that book is in our curriculum anymore, maybe. Mm-hmm. I think it's still summer reading for Bryn Mawr students. So when I've taught Bryn Mawr students, they've often referred to it. That's I think that still holds up. It's been a few years since I've read it, but just great stories. Mm-hmm. And I think gets to the absurdity of the war. We start off the unit talking about how Vietnam was an absurd war. It didn't make sense, as opposed to, say, World War II. And I think those stories really show that.
Going back to your thought on Kennedy's legacy and what he might have left behind if he lived, would his, I guess he was in his second term, right? That was
he was just running for a second term. So
okay.
He's elected in 60 and then killed in 63. Yeah.
Okay. Would his rest of his presidency have looked similar to Johnson's, do you think?
Yeah, that's fascinating. I would guess not. They were such different personalities, first of all, had some of the same values. Of all the people that we teach, that I teach in that class, LBJ maybe is the most complicated. And so much really good happens in his term, and then it's all overshadowed by Vietnam. So I don't know. That's a fascinating question. And if the Vietnam War didn't happen, what would the rest of Kennedy's term have looked like? Is just fascinating. On the other hand, LBJ ended up, and it took him maybe a little bit to get there, super committed to civil rights, and maybe in a way that the Kennedys weren't. Talking about Dr. Thornberry. Dr. Thornberry was never a fan of the Kennedys.
Really?
And and I remember that from taking his class, and have talked about it with him since. Probably first and foremost because of their lack of commitment to civil rights. It was tepid, maybe more tepid than people realize.
Yeah. And it's surprising how LBJ was. Did he waver in his commitment to civil rights? I wonder.
Yeah, I don't know. And we talk about this a lot in class, about how much of it was because he was really committed to civil rights, or how much of it was because he sort of wanted to increase his own power and stature and be the guy that sort of brought these laws into place. But whatever reason, it almost doesn't matter. These monumental civil rights laws were passed. Yeah, in 64 and 65, the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. So it sort of depends. I mean, in many ways, he was really racist.
I mean, he's from the South,
from Texas. Growing up in Texas in the early 20th century. Certainly used language and ideas that we would find abhorrent today. And yet at the same time, he's responsible in many ways for some of the most important pieces of legislation.
A movie that I love about his campaign all the way. I think that's on HBO too. Yes,
man, you watch it all.
I know. Well, I'm really not a big TV watcher, but
you watch all the good stuff. Yeah, with Bryan Cranston.
He is amazing.
He's amazing. Love that guy. He's amazing. I didn't do it this year, but last year we actually watched a fair amount of that. That's a great sort of psychological portrait of him,
because he gets his persona to the T.
Exactly.
If I understand what LBJ was like, he was just so persuasive. He would like tower over people. And
Johnson treatment. You got it.
Johnson treatment.
Yeah, that's what it's called. Yep, you got it. Yeah, Bryan Cranston was brilliant in that. And that was a play first. I actually saw the play, not with him. Bryan Cranston was in the play originally. I saw it with someone else, but and then saw the HBO movie. Yeah, really good. Yeah.
So that's a recommendation for sure.
Definitely, no question.
And I'd love to get to your book recommendation too that you brought in today. Yeah. So what are you reading?
You asked me to bring in a book, and I'm actually not someone that usually sort of writes down what I read, but I was having such a good streak during quarantine that I started to document what I read. This was one of my first quarantine reads. It's called The Unwinding by George Packer. And I think it's probably my favorite quarantine read, the favorite book I've read since March. And George Packer, who's a contemporary writer, sort of historian, has written for The New Yorker a bunch, I think now with The Atlantic, sort of takes on U.S. history in the Obama years up to Trump, but Trump is never mentioned in the book, and it's about the experiences of everyday people, and especially how they responded to the 2008 market crash. And interspersed in there are sort of 2-page portraits of some celebrities like Oprah Winfrey, or some politicians like Elizabeth Warren. So it's sort of like an on-the-ground history of 2008 to 2015, it was published before Trump was elected, but a lot of people, once Trump was elected in 2016, said this is a book that sort of explains that election more than anything.
Like how Trump came to power and how he,
in a way that doesn't even mention Trump, but just sort of why people would think that politicians don't have their interest at heart, why someone who has the messages that Trump had of build the wall and blame China or whatever would find that appealing. Sort of how so many ordinary Americans were suffering. And I think more than anything traces the breakdown of institutions, whether it's unions or the media or whatever. And Trump's election, maybe more than anything, was sort of about giving the middle finger to institutions, right? And so I think this book does a really good job of exploring that. And the fact that it's not about Trump per se maybe makes it even more powerful.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. It's almost I forget what we could call that in art class. I would have to ask Connolly, but like the opposite of the subject, the shadow, or they're explaining the negatives.
There you go.
Right.
There you go. Absolutely, that's a great way to put it. Yeah.
I'm curious what your thoughts are on just the polarization in terms of like why people have lost trust in institutions and have turned to someone like Trump.
Right.
And just really from a personal experience talking to people, I think social media and media exacerbates everything, but we live in different realities. Like everyone has their convicted idea of what America looks like and what are the flaws and what's wrong with it.
Yep.
But you can have a totally 100% different viewpoint on everything.
Yep.
Do you think that, like, I'm curious what your thoughts are on how this can balance out, like the polarization, or is it just, can it get worse?
I don't know. And sometimes I'm tempted, maybe as a history teacher, to say like, there was never this sort of golden era. I think sometimes people falsely think that like there was a time when all Americans got along, or all politicians used to.
There are always two sides.
Exactly, or many sides, and our country's been very divided before. I mean, probably most, especially during the Civil War. So things are really bad now. It's not that they were ever great in terms of polarization, but I do think that distrust in institutions is a major story that has happened. And I bring it back to my class, but maybe that started, sort of simplistic to say, it started during Vietnam and Watergate in the 60s and 70s, and we've sort of been eroding at the institutions since then.
Do you, in your classes, do you have conversations or debates, and I'm sure you do, about like current events? Do you focus more on the historical aspects of everything leading up to now? I know in my English classes, like after the vice presidential debate, for instance, I like brought that into the class the next day, and I'm not sure if that's a good practice or not, but it feels so relevant that you have to almost.
Absolutely, definitely, yeah. And so I try to, and my 10th graders this year, I mean, it was a stretch, but I tried to connect the elections that happened obviously this fall with the class, and I actually sort of took a couple weeks out and had them watch a documentary about Biden and Trump. And respond to it. So I'm trying to get them engaged and maybe look for themes that are current to us that we're also talking about in the class. I think there are a couple of tricky parts, right, of talking about current events. One is that some students are super engaged and they're reading all sorts of stuff, and some students just don't know what's going on at all, which is fine. I was probably somewhere in the middle when I was 15. That's totally fine. And then also the problem of it can get too emotional. And so much of what we've talked about as faculty, I mean, this, is not being scared of those, what are they called? Courageous conversations. I have that right. Whether it's about current events or race or ethnicity or sexual orientation or whatever, but it's hard. Right. And I feel myself sort of walking on eggshells and not wanting to have a blow up in class,
Yeah.
But try to overcome that feeling.
Right, because it's necessary.
Absolutely.
In terms of your understanding
Absolutely.
of it. And I was having a conversation with one of my friends after was that last week, the Capitol building?
Yeah, January 6th, yeah.
I just feel like talking about it and having like a 2-hour conversation about it and not settling, but expressing our differences in opinion makes me understand my own a little bit more, and yours too.
You got it. Absolutely.
And that kind of has to happen in school and has to be officiated almost by a teacher.
Absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And of course, you have to have an open mind for that to happen, And so trying to encourage students to have open mind, which I think the vast majority of our kids do. So some of those conversations have been great. And also, I think especially in the last year, I mean, there's always historic stuff going on, but like 2020, I mean, come on, like this is crazy, right? Like we are true. And I've tried to emphasize that to kids, like you're living through stuff that will be talked about in history books forever. I mean, as long as people are talking about U.S. history and world history. I mean, so it feels like a dereliction of duty as a history teacher not to talk about it, and try to figure it out at least a little bit, or at least discuss it.
Absolutely. So Matt, maybe one or two more questions. I just want to get back to your experience at Gilman and teaching here, and maybe what motivates you to continue pursuing a career in education, and maybe what do you love so much about your job at Gilman?
Yeah, where to start? I mean, as I said, when I was a student, just looking at my teachers, it seemed like they were having a really fun time reading books and talking about the ideas in the books. And I think that to me is still the most fun part of it. And so I've certainly thought about, do I want to be teaching for the next 10, 20 years or whatever. You know, I'm now at the point, unlike you, where like maybe I have more years teaching behind me than in front of me, or it's about the midway point, right? And so, you know, start thinking, not that I'd want to change professions, but administration or something like that. And the answer is, the thing I like most about my job is being in the classroom with the kids, reading interesting stuff and talking about it with the kids. And so I think that's what motivates me more than anything. And the coaching too, and that's obviously a big part of the job. I used to coach with a guy named Randy Dace. He was a Gilman parent, and then a longtime coach at Towson. We were on the same basketball staff together with Owen Daly. And he said to me once, the thing I love about my job is that I end every day on a court or a field, which is cool, right? That was a great way to think about it. That I end every day. Like that's a great aspect of the job.
Yeah, it's true.
You know,
that's a good point.
You're on the lacrosse field at the end of every day or whatever. I get to be on the basketball court. Or back in the fall when we're normal intramural golf. I mean, I'm actually paid to take kids to a golf course and play some golf. Yeah, right. I mean, that's a pretty nice perk of the job.
Yeah, there are so many perks.
Yeah,
I'd say.
Yeah,
I think I had a moment like that actually with Brian, like first year on the lacrosse field, talking about like The Great Gatsby or a paragraph that we did in class, and it's like, doesn't get better.
You guys, they should have recorded that. That's like the poster for teacher coach right there, right?
Teacher coach model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. That's awesome. And then I had another thought for you. That might be it for today. Okay. Is there anything that I didn't ask that maybe I should have asked, or that we didn't get to talk about? I'm trying to.
I don't know. I think you got it. I mean, my time at Gilman, what I teach, what I like about teaching, some good conversations about history. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything you're watching or reading right now that you would recommend?
Yeah, that's a good
apart
question.
from the Packer book?
Yeah. So I just finished a book as well. I'm in between books. I literally just yesterday finished a book called Churchill and Orwell, which is a sort of dual biography of them.
George Orwell?
George Orwell.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I also just finished over winter break The Vanishing Half, which is I'd recommend that for. I don't read a lot of fiction. That's sort of one of my 2 or 3 novels that I'll read. Which was really good. Watching, I don't know, my wife and I are talking about this. We don't have a show right now. I think partly because of what you said. It's like there's so much choice. We were on such a good streak the beginning of quarantine. We just were eating up Netflix and HBO and motoring through our DVR, and we've sort of hit a pause in the last couple months. I don't know.
Yeah. And it's just the browsing is annoying for me. I'd much rather just... My new philosophy on that is like I need a recommendation that someone swears by before I even go into it.
Right.
You know?
Right. Well, the other part of TV show is like a pretty big commitment, right? I mean, it's like
a series. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, how many hours of your life? Like, so you got to really commit to it. One thing we're watching as a family, I have a 5th grade son and 7th grade daughter, is Modern Family, which I'd never watched before. For whatever reason, that show never made it into my watching until the last year. And so every night we go through an episode or two. And it's really funny and clever and like good family fun and fun for the four of us to sit on the couch together and watch it.
It's not as serious, you know.
It's not,
it's just so light. You need that. You need that in these times.
Absolutely. Some comedic relief, no question.
Yeah. My mom always gives me crap because she's like, Jake, like she asks me for a book recommendation. It's always something kind of semi-dark or heavy.
Right.
Like my dad would watch Ozark and she's like, can we just watch something that's light? You know?
Yep, absolutely. It sounds like your viewing habits tend to be pretty serious too. If you seems like you've seen every history documentary movie too. Yeah. So something light is certainly.
It's a Modern Family in my life.
Exactly. And I recommend it. Yeah.
And then the last question, is there anyone at Gilman that you would like or be interested in watching on the podcast and would like to hear from?
Who hasn't been on at this point? Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe there's so many teachers that I'd like to hear. And I've actually really enjoyed. It's actually been a great way listening to some of the episodes to get to know my colleagues better. And so I wish I had those conversations when we sit next to them at lunch. Maybe someone from lower school, just because we don't, we don't interact as much. And certainly Max has just adored. My son has adored his lower school teachers. So maybe someone from lower school, just because again, I would think I would learn so much from them.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about how the little guys are doing right now.
Yeah,
how they can wear those masks all day.
Exactly.
Exactly. Awesome. Well, Matt, thank you so much for coming on. It's been a lot of fun talking.
Really appreciate you asking me on. Thank you so much for having me.
Have a good one. Thank you.
Too.